They tell you that the global financial system runs on trust and transparency. Well, they're lying.
They are lies.
Liars.
For 50 years, it's run on oil, dollars, and war. And it all has to do with the petrodollar. The petrodollar system goes like this. America prints paper, everyone else has to buy it to keep the lights on, and we all pretend that this is totally normal. But what happens when half the world stops pretending? That's what we're watching right now. My name is Louis, and you're watching the Coin Bureau. Now, first things first, this isn't financial advice, and I'm not your financial advisor. What follows is an explanation of how oil, dollars, and war have shaped the world economy since 1974. And if you want to keep learning about the protection rackets that run the planet, well, you know what to do. Smash that like and subscribe button, and also ring that notification bell so that you stay informed on all of the latest news. Okay, so let's start with what the petrodollar actually is, because most explanations make it sound like a natural law rather than what it really was. Protection racket with good PR. It all began in August of 1971, when Richard Nixon pulled off one of history's greatest bait and switches. He announced America would no longer convert dollars to gold, effectively telling the world that the green paper that they've been accumulating was now backed by nothing but American promises. They called it the Nixon shock. The Bretton Woods system, which had anchored global finance since 1944, died that day. Foreign currencies had been pegged to the dollar, and the dollar to gold at $35 an ounce. This gave America the privilege of printing the world's reserve currency while everyone else had to actually earn it. Foreign central banks had no choice but to accumulate massive dollar reserves, effectively giving America free loans to fund its consumption and wars. But by 1971, the US had printed far more dollars than it had gold, and foreign countries started calling Washington's bluff. They wanted to redeem their dollars for gold as per the agreement. This rapidly drained America's gold reserves, and the game was up. The result was an existential crisis for the US. Its power depended in large part on printing dollars and forcing the rest of the world to buy them. But without gold backing, why would anyone even do that? The solution came from an unlikely source, the 1973 oil crisis. That year, the US sent Israel 22,000 tons of weapons to help defend it against Syria and Egypt during the Yom Kippur War. Arab members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, protested by cutting oil production and embargoing exports to US and other allies of Israel, causing the price of oil to quadruple. This was a catastrophe for oil importing countries. Since international oil trade was already conducted primarily in dollars, foreign governments had to scramble for even more dollars to buy the same amount of oil at quadrupled prices. The result was a massive transfer of wealth. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other OPEC nations were suddenly drowning in dollars, hundreds of billions more than they could possibly spend domestically. These petrodollars, piling up in their central banks, needed to be invested somewhere to generate returns. And that's when Washington realized that this was the perfect trap. If they could convince oil producers to recycle these dollars back into US Treasury bonds, it would create a closed loop. Countries need dollars to buy oil, pay those dollars to OPEC, who then basically lends them back to America. The crisis had created the architecture for permanent dollar dominance. And so, William Simon, Nixon's Treasury Secretary, was dispatched to Saudi Arabia in July of 1974 with the proposition. Contrary to popular belief, there was no single formal treaty with an expiration date. Instead, the system emerged through a series of public commissions and secret understandings. The public face of the system was the U.S.-Saudi Arabian Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation, established June 8, 1974. With this organization, Saudi Arabia agreed to price oil exclusively in dollars and invest surplus revenues in U.S. treasuries. In exchange, America provided military protection and advanced weapons, and turned a blind eye to whatever the House of Saud decided to do at home and abroad. The Saudis also insisted on one condition: absolute secrecy. King Faisal allegedly feared an Arab backlash if it became known that Saudi billions were financing Israel's primary patron. So the US Treasury created a secret mechanism, allowing the Saudis to bypass normal Treasury auctions and hide their holdings under the vague heading oil exporters. This arrangement remained classified for over 4 decades, only revealed through a Freedom of Information Act request in 2016. And this arrangement forced every nation on earth to stockpile dollars just to buy energy, creating permanent artificial demand for American currency. The US could run massive deficits without the sort of consequences that would cripple any other nation. It's as if you could print monopoly money, force everyone to use it for groceries, then have them lend it back to you so that you could print even more. As of 2023, approximately 80% of global oil sales were still conducted in dollars, though that number is dropping fast. Now, as with all backdoor deals, the petrodollar system needed financial infrastructure, specifically a way to move vast sums of money outside normal channels for purposes that couldn't withstand public scrutiny. And as with all off-the-books government financing, this meant committing just about every crime in the book. And like most financial crimes, it involved banks, specifically the BCCI. The Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, was founded in 1972 by Pakistani financier Aga Hassan Abidi. It wasn't really a bank, though. It was a global money laundering operation with a banking license, and what prosecutors called, quote, the largest bank fraud in world financial history. By the time of its 1991 collapse, an estimated $10 to $20 billion had been identified as missing, defrauding depositors across 72 different countries. But calling it fraud misses the point. BCCI was criminal by design. The bank's structure was split between Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands to ensure that no single regulator could see the full picture. It maintained banks within banks, like the International Credit and Investment Company, that functioned as conduits for hiding catastrophic losses and creating fake profits. Its major shareholders allegedly included prominent Saudis swimming in petrodollars. They weren't real investors, though. The bank lent them money to buy its own shares, then held those shares as collateral for fake loans. It was a shell game where BCCI pretended to have wealthy Arab backing while actually owning itself. According to the 1992 Kerry Committee report, the U.S. Senate's definitive investigation, BCCI operated as a, quote, full-service bank in the worst sense of the phrase. It laundered money for the Medellin cartel and Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega. It financed arms deals and held accounts for terrorist organizations, including Abu Nidal, and it even helped Pakistan secretly develop nuclear weapons. And, according to former BCCI insiders cited in multiple investigations, its, quote, protocol department operated as a sophisticated blackmail apparatus, allegedly compromising Saudi sheiks and U.S. senators with blackmail. The bank's 1991 collapse was triggered after an undercover agent randomly walked into a BCCI branch in Florida. It bears the hallmark of what intelligence analysts call a controlled demolition, the deliberate destruction of an asset that had outlived its usefulness, allowing its handlers to walk away while the foreign bank took the fall for decades of shared criminality. But the BCCI's most important function was serving as the financial utility for intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA and Pakistan's ISI. The Kerry Committee report revealed that the CIA had extensive knowledge of BCCI's criminality as early as 1985, but continued using it for covert operations. This wasn't accidental. In 1976, after congressional investigations constrained the CIA in the wake of the Watergate scandal, intelligence services from France, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Morocco, and Iran formed the Safari Club, essentially a privatized CIA funded by petrodollars. The network operated in the shadows, bypassing the legal and political restraints of Washington's public government. BCCI became their bank, with Saudi intelligence chief Kamal Adham, the CIA's primary liaison in the Arab world, as a major shareholder. According to investigative journalist Joseph Trento, the bank's evolution was guided by Saudi intelligence to provide a deniable mechanism for financing covert operations in the post-Watergate era. The system's largest application was Operation Cyclone, the CIA's program to arm the Afghan Mujahideen. A secret agreement had Saudi Arabia match U.S. funding dollar for dollar, ultimately totaling billions, with the money flowing through BCCI to Pakistan's ISI. The ISI channeled most of that aid to Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, a radical Islamist and major heroin trafficker. This transformed Afghanistan into the world's heroin capital. And by 1980, just 1 year after covert aid began, the Afghan-Pakistan border was supplying 60% of America's heroin, up from virtually 0% at the start of the decade. This represented what former Canadian diplomat and UCLA professor Peter Dale Scott has called, quote, deep politics in action, a hidden continuity of power between Wall Street, oil companies, and intelligence agencies. Scott's concept describes the realm where public political processes intersect with covert, unaccountable structures of power. Put simply, the petrodollar system was the financial foundation for a parallel foreign policy executed through covert channels. BCCI's collapse was a deep event, momentarily revealing this hidden machinery before official cover-ups contained the narrative. The collapse of BCCI in 1991 scattered the components of the petrodollar's secret financial infrastructure. The U.S. Department of Justice actively obstructed investigations. The Bank of England sat on evidence of massive fraud at BCCI for 15 months, and the CIA stonewalled Congress for over a year. But the networks that BCCI serviced didn't disappear. The foreign fighters recruited for Afghanistan, including Osama bin Laden, evolved directly into al-Qaeda. According to Scott's analysis, the decade between BCCI's collapse and 9/11 represented a period of what he called metastatic chaos in covert finance. And when countries started challenging American petrodollar hegemony directly, the response was instructive. The pattern was established early and repeated often. Challenge the petrodollar, face regime change. In November 2000, Saddam Hussein announced Iraq would sell oil exclusively in euros, calling the dollar, quote, the currency of the enemy. As the euro appreciated against the dollar, Iraq earned hundreds of millions in additional revenue. Threat was contagion. If other OPEC members followed suit, it could unravel the entire petrodollar system. According to the Petrodollar Warfare thesis, the petro-euro challenge was a critical, under-discussed factor threatening the core of U.S. financial hegemony. The U.S. knew Iraq had no nuclear program. Israeli bombers had destroyed it in 1981. One of the first acts of the occupation of Iraq was Executive Order 13303, switching Iraqi oil sales back to dollars. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi went even further. By 2009, as chairman of the African Union, he was promoting a gold-backed African dinar for oil sales. This would have freed an entire continent from both dollar dependency and the French-controlled CFA franc that still to this day enslaves 14 African nations economically. Libya had 143 tons of gold reserves, and it was debt-free. Declassified emails to Hillary Clinton revealed French motives went beyond humanitarianism. An April 2, 2011 email from Sidney Blumenthal explicitly states, quote, Gaddafi's government holds 143 tons of gold and a similar amount in silver, intended to be used to establish a pan-African currency based on the Libyan golden dinar. French President Nicolas Sarkozy identified this as a threat to, quote, the financial security of the world and France's dominance in Francophone Africa. The 2011 NATO intervention, marketed as humanitarian protection under the responsibility to protect doctrine, ended with Gaddafi dead on the street. Hillary Clinton's response was, quote, we came, we saw, he died, followed by laughter. Libya now has open slave markets. Gold dinar project vanished overnight. The 2011 intervention in Libya marked a turning point. The sight of Western powers destroying another nation for monetary defiance showed the watching world that escaping dollar hegemony required collective action. The weaponization of the dollar had been escalating for years. The 2014 sanctions on Russia over Crimea restricted Russian banks from Western capital markets, making de-dollarization a matter of national security for Moscow. Then came Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. The G7 froze $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves and ejected major Russian banks from SWIFT, effectively confiscating a sovereign nation's savings, cutting it out of the financial system. The message was loud and clear. Dollar reserves and your access to global markets could vanish overnight if you upset the Western axis. China, watching Russian reserves frozen, understood that it was next. With over $3 trillion in foreign reserves, mostly in dollars, Beijing faced an existential threat. But back to 2014. By this point, the BRICS nations had established the New Development Bank, or NDB, and the Contingent Reserve Arrangement. These were direct alternatives to the World Bank and IMF. They operate on equal voting rights without the U.S. veto power that controls Bretton Woods institutions. At the same time, Russia and China have accelerated their de-dollarization efforts, establishing currency swap lines totaling hundreds of billions of dollars. By 2023, over 90% of Russia-China trade was settled in yuan or rubles. Meanwhile, the NDB had approved over $32 billion in projects since 2024, still a fraction of the World Bank's lending, but growing rapidly. Development finance could work without Washington's approval. BRICS expansion in 2024 brought key energy producers like Iran and the UAE into the bloc. Saudi Arabia was invited to join, but hasn't yet formally accepted, though their involvement in alternative financial systems suggests an alignment. With another 34 nations expressing interest, the bloc contains the world's major energy producers actively building a parallel financial system. By 2023, around 20% of global oil trades were already settled in non-dollar currencies. Russia sells to India in rupees, to China in yuan. Saudi Arabia now accepts yuan for Chinese oil purchases. Even so, talk of a unified BRICS currency is fanciful and faces immense hurdles. The real technical threat is Project mBridge, the blockchain platform for cross-border payments using wholesale CBDCs. Its participants include China, the UAE, Hong Kong, Thailand, and even Saudi Arabia. Unlike political declarations about new currencies, mBridge is operational, allowing instant settlement in local currencies without touching the dollar or SWIFT. Over 160 participants from 30 jurisdictions have conducted trials. It's still far from being rolled out, but this is the plumbing that can make non-dollar energy trade efficient and sanctions-proof. The U.S.-Saudi Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation, the public face of the 1974 arrangements, was allowed to lapse in June of 2024 without renewal. While there was never a formal 50-year treaty to expire, this symbolic end coincided with Saudi Arabia joining China's digital currency projects. And this brings us to the present day. Every sanction, every frozen asset, every military intervention to defend the dollar has only accelerated the search for alternatives. The more aggressively Washington wields the dollar as a weapon, the more urgently others seek escape routes. The loss of reserve currency status would likely force America to choose between its global military presence and domestic spending. The U.S. currently runs a $1.8 trillion annual deficit, possible only because foreign central banks must hold dollars. Foreign nations hold over $8.8 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities. If even a fraction of this seeks the exit, the Federal Reserve faces printing money to buy the bonds or letting interest rates soar. Crypto also offers escape routes from both dollar hegemony and its potential replacements. Bitcoin doesn't care about sanctions or SWIFT codes. Iran, Venezuela, and Russia have all used crypto to circumvent sanctions with varying success. A world running on crypto would have its own problems, though, starting with the fact that most of it is owned by a tiny elite. But alternatives now exist at every level. So, while the petrodollar system isn't dead, It's no longer the only game in town. Half the planet is building workarounds as the 50-year protection racket slowly unravels. The mechanisms that enforce dollar hegemony, war, sanctions, frozen reserves, have convinced much of the world that escape is worth any price. BRICS nations, representing 55% of global population and 44% of global GDP, are building an alternative system after watching decades of these tactics. Some would say it's about time. And if you want to learn more about how that's going, you could check out our most recent updates on BRICS in the age of Trump 2.0. And you could find that video right over here. Now, that is going to be it for me for now. As always, though, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next video. This has been Lewis, signing off.